video option for it. But please keep your video on.
Yes, all panelists, please keep your video on.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third of the series of webinars that Praja has been having in Mumbai. The seminars is on reimagining Mumbai post-COVID. Before we get into the seminar, we would like to start with a short film of Praja, which basically describes what Praja does and how Praja works. Please start the film.
He's given him, section's gone.
When we come together as one, we will be heard. Log on to praja.org, form communities, talk to those in power, and get things done. Praja, let's do something.
Sorry. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome once again for this webinar. As I mentioned, this is our third webinar in our series of webinars that we've been having on reimagining Mumbai. Before we get into the introductions, I'd just like to say a couple of house rules. One is that please, everybody, the participants, except the participants, everybody who's doing the webinar, please keep yourself muted and stop your video. Also, there is a chat box which you can use to ask questions. You can also raise your hands and the moderator will recognize you and you'll be able to ask your questions on that. So these are the basic house rules. We really appreciate you to respect these house rules. So this crisis that has hit Mumbai is something that is an exceptional crisis. This pandemic is something that is not only affecting Mumbai, but has affected the entire world. And nobody was prepared for this crisis, not the government, not the municipal corporation, not the citizens. And this is something that has hit us like a ton of bricks. And everybody was scrambling to address these issues. The government, the municipal corporation of Mumbai, the state government, the police, and also, importantly, the corporate sector and the NGO sector also stepped in to support the citizens of Mumbai in this hour of crisis. But if this crisis has also exposed the frailties of Mumbai as a city, its physical and social infrastructure. Today's panel discussion is going to discuss how corporate world stepped in and supported the citizens of Mumbai, and most importantly, what needs to be done by the corporate world to support the support and influence the government to make Mumbai a more inclusive and friendly city for its citizens. It will also discuss how corporates can support civil society to see that we all work towards the goal of an inclusive and a citizen-friendly city. For this, we have a very eminent panel with us here today and an equally eminent moderator. I would like to start by introducing the panelists for this program, for this discussion today. We have with us Mr. Anuj Bhagwati, who is the director of AT Industries. He's also a trustee at the UDRI Institute, that is Urban Design Research Institute. He is also a trustee at the KJ Somaya Trust and an advisory in the Cornell University in USA. He's joined by Mr. Samir Somaya, who is the Chancellor of Somaya Vidya Vihar University, Chairman of the KJ Somaya Medical Trust, and Chairman and Managing Director of Godavari Biorefineries. Samir has played an active role in initiatives that improve the quality of life of underprivileged sections of society. Under his guidance, the Somaya Trust manages over 30 different educational institutions, right from elementary school to PhD programs. He's joined by Deval Sanghi, who is a co-founder and partner of Dasra. Deval has been working since the last 20 years in the area of the social sector. Dasra is a philanthropic organization. Dasra has actively shaped and developed this NGO sector to scale nationwide, advising philanthropists and foundations in their giving strategies and supporting collaborative action in urban sanitation, adolescents, and more recently, migrant workers. This program is being moderated by Iris Madera, who is a trustee of the Praja Foundation, as well as in her professional capacity, a partner at Madhvi Desai Consulting Private Limited, which is an organization that advises and counsels on higher education for students in Mumbai and across the country. So Iris, I'd like to hand over the mic to you now, and please, we welcome all of you once again for this panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitai, for those introductions, and welcome everybody to Praja's third webinar. We have with us three individuals who've been residents of Mumbai and who have, for not just through this pandemic, but for decades, been very, very involved with change in this city. As individuals, as part of their businesses, as part of organizations, nonprofits, etc. And each of them, in their capacity, have been critical of what Mumbai has not achieved, but have always jumped right up enthusiastically to actually support change and work with the powers that be, whether they were individuals, institutions, government bodies, to actually push through and nudge through that change. So we'd like to dedicate the first 15 minutes of this panel discussion to perhaps what are the gaps that each of these individuals have been privy to as the pandemic rolled in and took Mumbai by grip. And let's start with Anuj Bhagwati. If he can tell us, with his deep experience with respect to city planning, urban design, and urban governance, what are the gaps that he has seen get perhaps wider, or new gaps that have popped up as the pandemic rolled in? Anuj, over to you.
So thank you, Iris. Thank you, everybody at Praja. And thank you for all of you that are tuning in to listen to us. It's a pleasure to be here. and share with you some of the learning that I've had, some of the thoughts that I've had in the past few weeks, few months, and really actually even much before that, because many of our problems that we face today are things that at some level one could have predicted. Why do I say this? So I think that many seemingly unrelated issues are actually connected through their common dependence on city planning. If you think about the common topics of discussion these days, the spread of COVID, hospitals, hospital beds, migration of workers, troubles in restarting our economy, our economic opportunities as India vis-a-vis China. While it seems that we're talking about epidemiology, healthcare, economics, business, what we're actually discussing it without really naming it are all symptoms of our continued systemic failures in managing our cities. So the reality on the ground is very much a result of our continued determination, I think, as a country to look the other way. And I feel that that's the real reason that we paid such a huge human price, such a massive medical, economical, psychological, every kind of price in the current crisis. We would always have had to pay a heavy price, but I think that the reasons that we face such a heavy price are actually because of the lack of proper planning. So why do I say this? So if you look at how is the spread of a deadly virus connected to city planning? We say prevention from infection requires hand washing, or it requires social distancing. Hand washing is a privilege that is not available to a large percentage of our urban citizens who live in slums. Even if they share water connections or toilets with a large number of people, we've seen that this is not really effective in spreading disease. If you want to retard the spread through quarantining, it requires that homes at least have water and sanitation. It requires that you have enough housing so there's no overcrowding inside. It requires that you have enough capacity in public transport, sufficient footpath area. So the things that I've talked about, water, sanitation, housing, transport, social amenities, these are all the main subjects of urban planning. And these are all things at which we failed in the past decades. And that's why I said that this is something that's been a long time coming. If you look at a lack of healthcare capacity, that's also got something to do with defective urban planning. If we do not provide space for primary healthcare clinics and other care facilities when we lay out parts of our cities, or we maintain enough open spaces, we have no chance of achieving a reasonable level of public health. Our hospital beds have always been too few. We don't have enough primary healthcare clinics in many, many places. And I think one of the reasons that Kerala did better than many states, many places, is because they have a much deeper network of primary healthcare clinics. If you look at the question of migration, even migration, why did people need to go back to villages? So there are, of course, economic reasons, there are emotional reasons that people went back to where they were from when they were faced with a crisis. But had we had enough safe housing, including a sufficient stock of rental housing, then the whole situation would not only have been safer health-wise, but it would also have been much more amenable to government intervention. You can also connect our problems today to the problems that we have in attracting investment, or the problems that we'll have in the economy, because it's very important that we consider this as we get back into production, we get back to our workplaces. I think that many colleagues that I've worked with, people that I know from business that are working for European and American companies, when they talk about India vis-a-vis China, one of the things they refer to is China's superior infrastructure. It's not only physical infrastructure, it's also social infrastructure. which means healthcare, education, including universities, but primary education, which really makes for very good workers, trained workers, trainable workers as well. So I think that an important reason impacting investment is the same as the reason that there are more tourists that visit China than come to India. Place is cleaner, it's better organized, living well enough is cheaper, it's safer. So I think that to attract investment, we have to, among other things, make our cities much more attractive. So I'll probably stop there. I think if I look back and look at problems, then this is probably enough. I think we should spend much more time listening to the others, of course, and then also talking about solutions. So I hope that answers a little bit of what you'd like me to say, Iris.
Thank you very much, Anuj. It does, and you've listed out key areas where you've said gaps have always existed, but those gaps have obviously exacerbated this pandemic and we've paid a much heavier price. So sanitation and water, the supply of healthcare, adequate and safe housing, particularly because it harks back to very old rental policy that we're still following. And of course, investments in infrastructure that make this city attractive and livable, right? All of those together. Thank you very much, Anuj. And I'd like to invite Samir Somaya now to address us with his experiences, both in terms of the business he runs, but also as somebody who has invested in public goods for the city and healthcare and education. Samir, tell us where you have seen the gaps, especially as they widened during the pandemic.
Thank you, Iris. Thank you, Praja. And thank you, everyone, for giving me this opportunity. You know, in many ways, businesses, governments, NGOs, we're all organizations. Our job is to come together and aim for a particular outcome. I'd like to talk about the first thing in its presence rather than its absence as a learning of a gap. The moment the pandemic hit, we saw lots of groups come together, lots of WhatsApp groups on how they could make a response to the acute problem that the pandemic has brought. In these WhatsApp groups, we found students, startups, companies, cooks, religious organizations, NGOs, businesses, all trying to come together to deal with the particular acute problem at hand. I think multidisciplinary, various occupations, various age groups, and everyone in these groups, I'm not saying this is everyone, but in these groups trying to see whether they could make a difference at that particular point. And as a gap, when you say, so right now I'm not going to try and talk about it as whether it is well done or not, but I'm talking of the intent. The intent was good. The intent was to come together. The intent is to find a solution. And so the first thing I'm going to try and say is that whether this spirit, and so I would pick up a phone to a government official could pick up a phone to me, I would talk to a student would talk to me, you could talk to an NGO, whether this spirit of trying to work together with an immediately identifiable goal is something that this particular crisis showed that it could be filled, and what we normally do not have. So the question is, could we, when we think of solutions, whether they are dealing with acute problems or chronic issues, whether the same spirit of teamwork, common purpose, and noble intent can come together to fill up the gap that we here saw very vividly, and something that we could fall into. So I think that's the first thing I would like to say. And I'm saying a business is an organization, as is an NGO, as is a government, as is any other, where people come together in a spirit of teamwork within that organization. Here we saw spirit of teamwork between organizations and as well as individuals. So I think that's the first thing I'd like to talk about. My second thing, when we talk about gaps, I think in education, suddenly, we talk about change, we read about books about change and how we need to, but this is completely like the rug being pulled from under your feet. Suddenly the traditional model of education is gone. Whether it is for a short time or whether there is going to be a hybrid later, that the later time will tell. But at the current moment, that is gone. What is the immediate effect of that model in terms of teachers having to adapt? It was interesting today when I, who have 2 internet connections in my home for Wi-Fi, and my phone, which doubles up as a hotspot, did not work today for the first time in the last 2 months. And I called you to say that if I cannot join today, please excuse me. And then you suddenly see that a internet connection on Wi-Fi under such circumstances is clearly showing itself as a public good. Because if you are supposed to deliver education, how is it that you will deliver it if suddenly face-to-face meetings are not happening physically and we're happening digitally? You suddenly talk about digital infrastructure. You cannot anymore talk about just the physical infrastructures that regulatory bodies or private planners put on themselves. The third thing is the digital divide. Now, we as an organization deal with education across the spectrum, whether it is students from underprivileged or privileged backgrounds. Now, there is a child, for example, who has one electronic device at home, which is, let's say, his dad, and his dad is a daily worker. And so he can only see the recorded class when his dad comes home at 8 in the night, and suddenly accesses for that 1 or 2 hours what is there. So how do you deal with these challenges or these gaps of the digital divide, knowing fully well that there is going to be, and at the same time see the challenge and the opportunity to then deliver education in a wider and a more democratic and a more framework? I think we have to look at that as an opportunity, but this is another gap that is there. How do you train the teacher to teach on a digital framework in a manner in which to keep the child's or the student's attention? How do you make sure that learning itself transforms itself from a 4-year program to something that can also be encapsulated and also be for lifelong purposes? That's a second issue. In healthcare, as a teaching hospital, when we read about this pandemic in February as it spread in Italy and Spain, I had a conversation with one of the previous speakers, a common friend, Amit Chandra, and of course Anuj, who we share a lot. And we talked about, should the city need it? Are we ready for it? And we looked at it as a microcosm, our institution, and we realized that we were short of infrastructure as what we might need should the pandemic hit the city. And at that time, we started planning it that at worst, if we don't have it, we'll at least have equipment that we can use for the future. And we started planning. And it is, so then how do you go about planning something in anticipation of a need? Now, whether again it's acute or chronic, and get people together, whether it is donors, thinkers, planners, reading from what is happening for informed decision making, and again look at the gaps you have in doctors, nurses, or class 3, class 4 employees, admin staff, money, and people ultimately who again put it together. And how do you deal with fear? I think at the bottom of it, and government, how do you deal with government? Because government is part of the solution, but government also has to work with us in trying to find a solution to the problem together. So I think this is where I would like to state how we found the gaps. And we will also, as Anuj said, talk about some of the solutions we have when we come to that point. So thank you again for giving this opportunity.
Thank you, Samir. Thank you. You've added to the list that Anuj gave us to think about in terms of the gap. And yes, access to education and how the digital infrastructure and divide actually plays into that. Healthcare again, but from the other aspect of bringing together a number of groups, from donors to providers to nurses and doctors, and the gap that exists there. Thank you for that. And of course, interestingly, like you said, we know how to come together in groups, but the pandemic brought about a spirit that perhaps could have existed in the same quantum even before the pandemic. And going forward, which I'm eager to hear as we talk about in those solutions, how do we ride that wave actually and never let it die down to become a big solution? Thank you, Samir. And Deva, I'd like to invite you to speak next. You've again had a very, very deep relationship with many non-government, non-profit organizations and corporate Mumbai, where you've impacted their response to all that the city needs and people need and individuals need. We'd like you to share your deep insights on what you saw were the gaps that again sort of widened through the pandemic.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Iris. And again, thank you, Praja, and everyone who's listening today. I think this is definitely the steps we all need to take to hopefully learn and as well as collaborate. I think for us, and as you stated, I mean, I guess I've been fortunate to be serving in the NGO sector now for over 20 years. And I think what was very apparent once this crisis hit, and unfortunately is still apparent now, is that we as a sector, I guess, haven't done enough to really focus on dignity and equity. And I think those terms are critical because many times as NGOs or funders or CSR even, at times maybe quick solutions are looked at to support and Band-Aid solutions as well. And Anuj talked a little bit about this even earlier about, just the resilience that any city should have, and comparing, I guess, with China too, there's a certain level of I guess, basic dignity and equity that one would assume any country provides its citizens. And I think in this tragedy, we've seen how different these basic rights are between those who have access to money and those who don't. And so I think a big gap for us, at least at the NGO sector, is what should we have done differently to really look at root cause problems. It's very important to focus on education or health or livelihoods or housing. But when you think of, for example, a community member, like a migrant, all of these things and perhaps a few more are required to enable them to have dignity and equity. And so real questions around, have we as a sector really pushed corporate India to think through this? Have we really pushed government to think about infrastructure? Have we provided a voice to these same communities who service day in and day out, and without which this city would not be built, we would not be able to do what we do. Yet we clearly turned not only a blind eye, but have ignored them completely from these basic rights, dignity and equity. And in doing so, we've left them to fend for themselves, to walk home, to leave the city. And it's no fault than our own on why they've left. And I think we need to really rethink on how we give them more of a voice and honestly more rights before they come back. I think if I look at CSR, and to your point, Iris, we've been fortunate to work with many companies. I think while it's been good to have CSR, 2% is not enough to have a sustainable society and a responsible society. It has to be 100% of what you do, and the additional 2% should be that added sort of icing on the cake, not the other way around. And so I think really having these conversations with funders, with corporates, with city leaders, including the government, to really talk about what is our responsibility to our own citizens and really challenge the status quo. Because if we continue down this path, clearly this is the first of many tragedies that'll happen. And unfortunately, the same community I'm speaking about that Anuj also said, who don't have access to toilets or running water, they have these sort of hiccups or tragedies every single year. But because we were not affected by it, we just say, oh, look, the city was resilient when that flood happened. Because our homes are not flooded, because our children still go to school and are not locked at home like they have been now. And so I think it's really overarching, how do we ask basic and fundamental questions as a sector, so NGO leaders themselves, and what are things we can do differently in our programs so we're not putting a Band-Aid solution. I think as funders, How do we actually change the power dynamic perhaps and lose some of the power we have in the voice and enable greater citizen leadership and voice? And then finally, as corporates, I think it goes again well beyond the 2%, but how do we actually change the social compact that we have with our workers, our contractors, our laborers, to ensure that perhaps we take lesser of the profit, but we're more equitable as a society as a whole? Thank you. I hope that's good enough for the first part.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Thank you, Deva. Absolutely. I mean, I think you said it well when you talked about dignity and equity. And I think Mumbai citizens, I think we really had our faces blackened when the pandemic hit, because we suddenly realized that we were far, far short of truly giving them the rights and the voices they needed to be equal citizens in the city that contribute to its running every day. So thank you for all those points. And yes, absolutely, we agree. So everyone in the audience, we've heard from 3 citizens and residents of Mumbai that have been deeply involved with many of these issues. And we've heard what some of these gaps are. And many of us I know in the audience resonate these, we've seen these firsthand. We also heard in between all of those sentences, opportunities, obviously, to actually go beyond this. In fact, perhaps opportunities to innovate and come up with solutions that we didn't think were possible, but perhaps the pandemic suddenly made that possible. You know, one simple example has been how we've all been able to sort of come together in a number of forums, talking to each other, whether it's a WhatsApp group or webinar, etc., which we've always had the technology to do, but we haven't actually put it to the test and put the power into it. I think we're finally doing that. It doesn't have to stop. So let's go back to each of our 3 panelists, and I'd like to start with Anuj again. To actually unlock for us, Anuj, what you see now as therefore the opportunities and solutions, particularly for Mumbai, from a policy perspective, from an action perspective, that we can sort of push for, nudge forward as individuals, as citizens in the city, as parts of organizations. Thank you. And we've got enough time for you to do that over at least 10 minutes.
I think so. I think you'll have to stop me though when you get started on this subject, as people that know me, Samir has suffered from this a lot in the past. So you might have to stop me. But
Okay.
I'll try to be good. And I think I'll actually take off from where Deval stopped in a way, because Deval asked us the question, really, whose point of view, whose city? And I think that's something that we've always been thinking about, whether it's at Praja, at the Urban Design Research Institute, or as individuals, because it's something that really comes to us when we think about framing of any rules of a society. In India, I think Mahatma Gandhi always asked this question, that we should really, whose point of view do we make our rules for? And for whom do we make our rules, and from whose point of view do we make them from? If you look at the contemporary philosophers, more contemporary philosophers than John Rawls has made this point of view. So I think the first thing we have to ask is from whose point of view. The next thing we need to do is that we need to set our priorities. Having adopted this mindset to ask really a little bit more deeply from whose point of view, I think what we have to do is to set our priorities. And priority setting means we have to decide what we will do, but it also means that we have to decide what we won't do. So you need a clearly stated set of objectives that you start with. These objectives should include the number of houses we build, the number of open spaces, the size of these open spaces, and so on and so forth. I think prioritizing means we have to choose to spend our money on the top few objectives. And a disproportionate amount of our resources on those objectives, whether they are money or whether they are time, whether they're the attention of the authorities. So we are not able, as people that have worked in this field for some time, we are not able to understand how really priorities like the Western Coastal Road come to be so high on our list, or ideas like the Western Coastal Road tend to come so high on our list. It's a terribly fraught project environmentally. It serves very few people, and it doesn't actually make good sense from the point of view of climate change. I think 2 days ago on one of these webinars, Amit Chandra talked about climate change and how we have to really prepare ourselves for this. Even when we were talking about right now about chronic versus acute, then the pandemic is acute. Climate change is going to be somehow one of those important things that may creep up on us, though we are seeing a lot of extreme weather events now, which is one of these things that we connect to climate change. And you see a lot of flooding or you see extreme events every few years connected to flooding. Now, Deval might say that we proved actually that it's not our priority. I think Shirish Patel has said this many times, that for us it's acceptable that we have this damage every few years because it's not our homes. And we've said that instead of putting in the infrastructure, we need to let the people get used to their homes getting flooded and them losing their belongings every once in a while. So I think that it's really important to ask from whose point of view to really fix that well and clearly and have public debate about it. And then also to really set objectives. When we have done that, then we should really move on to articulating our principles. And when we say articulating principles, we mean simple things. Maybe we should prioritize public transport over private transport. We should prioritize footpaths over roads. Usually we've tended to do the opposite in Mumbai. I'm really amazed every time I think about it. But we actually prioritize roads over footpaths. And we have to get all this right. We have to decide. We want to protect our heritage, our social and cultural spaces, to include broadband as part of our planning. In fact, the Urban Design Research Institute, still probably we have a website, it's called Sabke Liye Broadband. It was a project we did. We tried very hard to work with the authorities to include broadband access as something that, as Samir said, is to be viewed as infrastructure. Because it's now becoming one of those things that you get excluded if you don't actually have access to the internet. And so we said that we really need to prioritize this as a public good, not as something that's only private. I think that whatever we do, housing has to be our top priority. Now, we've had a lot of discussions about affordable housing. We personally believe that we should really talk about adequate housing, not just affordable housing. And adequate housing is really a broader concept where you look not only at the four walls and the roof and the cost, but you also look at other key aspects. You look at security of tenure, you look at habitability, you look at accessibility. So housing is really very important. It's absolutely essential. Without housing for all, I think we can't imagine humane living for all. You can't attain good health and well-being. Clean water and sanitation are key for all of these. You can't have good education if the children don't have a secure place to study. Especially today when you're going online, the importance of the home is actually much more important than it was before. It's much greater than it was before. So if you don't have homes, you can't have electrification. So how are kids supposed to learn online when they don't have homes? So I think that this is really important. And you also need to look at all the other aspects. So sunlight, ventilation, these are all very important things when it comes to housing. And that's what we included usually in our discussions when we say adequate. If you don't have enough sunlight and ventilation, you are going to have much more spread of disease. This pandemic has proven that. Well, for the coronavirus classes, of course, viruses, it's going to happen. But we've also seen this with tuberculosis. Tuberculosis in Mumbai is something that is chronic. We have a lot of cases that are, gone per day. There's a good study from Doctors for You, Mumbai nonprofit, that the Mumbai Metropolitan Region Environment Improvement Society has put out some years back. A couple of days back, there's another very good paper from Korea where they really map this all out. So I think it's very clear that, all these things regarding housing are important. And I often hear that there's no space. But if you actually look at a map of Mumbai, you'll see that there's a large amount of space near Mumbai. You can look at the eastern waterfront. You can look across the water at the mainland. That's something that more than 50 years ago, Charles Correa, Shirish Patel, Praveena Mehta did when they came up with the New Bombay proposal. You can look around Vasai Virar, you can look around Mira Bhayandar, you can look in Manori Gorai Uttan. There's a lot of place that is quite close to the city. You can use existing networks to get almost there. You just have to do the last mile connectivity with, say, bus rapid transit. That would augment the rail capacity quite well, and you could put millions of people in humane housing, decent densities, open spaces, and everything that you need. So going vertical everywhere is not an answer. In Mumbai, there are too many places where you have not enough space set aside for amenities. So you would have crowding of footpaths, of open spaces, of other amenities, and you would deny people of fresh air, ventilation, and this would accentuate our already dire tuberculosis situation. Once you have housing, then it's much easier to deliver water and sanitation. This needs to be top of our list of objectives. And whatever we do, I think we really have to take into account, the key environmental factors. I already talked about flooding. I already talked about climate change. There was a Chitle committee report after the 26/7/2005 deluge, largely unimplemented. So apparently preventing flooding is not high on our priority list. I mean, it may be high on some lists that we make sometimes, but implicitly we are proving that we don't actually care very much about flooding. I think I'll just wrap up by saying two things, because I think that if we want to make this shift, we need to have a couple of major governance things that we also take into account. So the first thing is that the 74th constitutional amendment, which was enacted a long time back, should be implemented more completely across the country. Much more power was to be transferred to urban local bodies. Instead, we still see very strong control of cities by the state government across the country. Praja has been researching this extensively. We heard also from our mayor 2 days ago in an earlier webinar about the problems of absolute lack of power in the elected representatives that are supposed to run the city. I think city administrations would then be more responsive to the people. They'd be closer and more direct accountability. It's something that's been mandated. I think this needs to happen. Another thing that needs to happen is that somewhere there needs to be a shift in the mindset of the government. I think it's a major governance issue for us right now, that the government is also trying to get into, profit-making activities, say from land that it holds. But I think that their first responsibility is to work for the public good, according to me, and what I understand. And I think that the government, when they stop thinking about working for the public good and they start thinking about making profit, then especially when it comes to land, I think that they have the wherewithal. There's a lot of government-owned land around Mumbai and around parts of the country. If they prioritize housing, I think it's quite easy, because they control so much of the land, that we can solve the problems that we have. But it requires a shift in mindset. It requires that they see themselves as trustees. They see themselves as a not-for-profit enterprise. And I personally can't think of a better use for government land than low-cost housing and public infrastructure development. So I think probably I've exceeded my quota, but so I'll hand over now, and I'm happy to come back and talk more about any one of these subjects or many more subjects as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anuj. And yes, I guess two key things that are the crux of what you see as solutions and obviously opportunities, and they're not new. We've needed them for a while. The fact that we as an urban center have to take back or take the power that actually has been devolved to us. And somehow we haven't done that, even though it exists. And we'll come back to hopefully discuss that in detail. And the second crux that you sort of pointed out is actually housing. If we can focus on housing, safe and accessible, we're talking about unlocking space we already have. We're talking about transportation networks that we know we can make and solving all the other little problems that go with it. So thank you for both those opportunities. Let's go over now to Samir, who I know has lots to say about all the aspects that he's very deeply involved with, lots of opportunities and innovations and solutions there, especially in the areas of public goods that he's been deeply involved with, both as an individual and as a business. So Samir, please give us your take on opportunities and solutions.
So thank you again. You know, my conversation with you, Iris, you wanted me to also specifically talk about what we were doing. So my conversation or response will be not as broad as maybe what Deval and Anuj's point would be, but I'll borrow from them. Deval spoke about CSR and the 2% or whether it's a lot or not enough. I just remember a conversation with my grandfather, whom Anuj also knew very well. And he always said he was a 6th grade boy who passed out, came from very humble beginnings and was poor until he was about in his 30s. But he did very well in life. And he always, his response of having done well, our business is of sugar and chemicals. So he did very well in sugar. And his point in education, which he started a sugar mill in 1939 in Ahmednagar. And in 1942 is when he established the first school right there in a village. And this is an area which is right now strongly populated by what we will call Ambedkari Buddhist community. So I often think that in that day and time, in 1942, when Ambedkar himself was a very young man, that it must have been a very interesting time and place where a young man striving to make his luck in life is opening a school for all people in a society in which the caste system is extremely rigid. And I cannot imagine what kind of social challenge that man must have faced. But his goal was, how do you make people who are outside? He had a different vision of what we call inclusion. We often define inclusion as bringing them inside the boundary which we currently exclude them from. He always used to say that mukhya ang banao. I think there is a big difference in inclusion and mukhya ang. Mukhya ang means you kind of give them center stage. I think that's what. So his whole creation of education, which started in that school in 1942, and then later on created the Somaiya Vidya Vihar Society, which is in Vidya Vihar. Now Vidya Vihar is named after our society, was to create that world, which is what he called was Samaj Rin. That is, how do you repay debt to society? Because businesses truly are social organizations. We ought to be financially sustainable. If we don't, every organization needs to be financially sustainable from wherever it draws its finances from. But they also need to be environmentally and socially sustainable. And in that, health is the greater good for the whole, I think, the whole society that we live in, because we are social organizations. So in a very similar way, because I know you're talking about Mumbai, but just to talk, we still work with lots of sugarcane farmers in rural Karnataka, 20,000 of them. So we would always try to teach them. I'm not going to get into the merits of sugar cane and whether it is water or not, but we try to teach them what makes for good farming, what makes for good intercropping so that they are not stuck with only one crop, what makes for good agronomy so that if they can use a particular bit of there are lots of interesting ways in which what is called agroecology, in which you can do fantastic ways in which you do good planting, good income, good soil for today and for tomorrow. So that is not looked upon as, I will say, CSR. It is looked upon as what I will consider good business practice in which all your stakeholders benefit, and the earth, the farmer, and the business and the customer, we all, and of course the taxation for which the government and therefore the rest of the people, we all need to grow, we all need to thrive, we all need to prosper. So I think Mumbai, coming to Mumbai, I think it's a great city. I mean, for all, I'm just trying to talk about it in a sense that it's a big metropolis in the largest democracy in the world, and it is a cosmopolitan city. It absorbs all. It has in India, it has, you could be comfortable speaking in a multitude of languages, you could be multilingual, and as such the city is also very safe, and it is welcoming, and it is friendly. I think, and that's much to, it's also a hub of culture. You have theater in various languages, you have music of all kinds, from jazz to Carnatic to Hindustani classical to Bollywood. And so how do we take this energy of the finance capital, which has the ingredients of a New York, the media hub, which has the ingredients of a LA, it probably needs to have the flavor of innovation of Boston or of Silicon Valley. How do you try and envisage a city which can absorb its wonderful, welcoming, absorbing, cosmopolitan, but then that one which is also extremely livable? What kind of ecosystem do we need to create that encourages them, that attracts talent? Ultimately, we want to attract talent, nurture ideas, and the transition. Now, nurturing ideas can mean many things. It means also nurturing, back to that whole concept of inclusion. Nurturing also means how do you bring people in. We run a scholarship program in the villages and a little bit in the city, which tries to identify children of demonstrated need and outstanding promise, and how do you bring them places to how do you bring them to places to study so that they can go further. I think in like in an education institution, how do you create that environment in which you provide a place to nurture these people, because I think we need to try and understand what education systems do we want to create. I think Anuj also mentioned, we don't want to create a two-tier system. We want to create a one-tier system. Can I create an education institution that welcomes all? It welcomes people. How do you fashion it? How do you imagine it? And I'm talking for ourselves, but I'm not talking only for ourselves. How do you provide one in which anybody feels that they are welcome to attend, irrespective of where they come from? How does an education institution itself imagine that it can make this possible? And it's also what a child wants to study if he or she wants to come in. So as an education city, we also think, how do you create a university which learns from the best, but it fashions itself in its own ideas. So we don't want to, we had a friend whom Porus Olpadwala, whom also Anuj knows, and he once told me, you've studied at Cornell, but don't try to create a duplicate of Cornell here. There's much that you have to learn in your own fashion. So एक की गुलामी छोड़ के दूसरे की गुलामी तो नहीं करनी है, आजाद अपने को रहना है, अपने ही बुनियाद पे अपने सपने देखने हैं. I think so that is the kind of concept that we are trying to do. How do you create a climate of discovery? How do you try to create research? We need to value our heritage, our aesthetic. We need to value our present. We need to know our present, and we need to imagine a better future. I think that's what we need to do. Now, if you look at health, if you come to healthcare, the same thing applies. If I look at the healthcare of Mumbai, A person like me, if he falls ill, he will think of going to a Breach Candy hospital, a fine hospital. I mean, and otherwise you find a section of society that goes to the teaching college hospitals of the city, which are run by the government. Now, again, the challenge is, can you create or imagine a healthcare system in which the person will go, if my, would I go to my teaching hospital? And likewise, would a poor person go to that teaching hospital? Could both go to the same place? Can we imagine can we imagine that, yes, that's the place I want, that I go to this place because it is the best? And I think that's so, even it was very interesting when we started our journey for this COVID, challenging ourselves to rise to this COVID challenge. We had only 20 beds that we thought we could do. We started a keto campaign to try and see whether we can make 20 to 50. And we had a lot of donors who came to us, not only through keto as a crowdfunding campaign, but also from outside. And we ultimately took that capacity to 377 beds for COVID care. And people came to us from all parts of the city, whether it was from the local Pratiksha Nagar slum or it was from a Breach Candy residence. And so that was what came to me, that if you say that you're going to provide good quality care, people will come. I think we definitely need, again, to look at public health, because healthcare, I think healthcare, if you look at the future, if you want to look at healthcare, you need to look at one point which is public health, which Anuj spoke about, and you look at the other point, which is personalized medicine, which is going again into genomics, this. How are you going to provide a system that makes it possible for both? Because they do intertwine. The kind of public health you are exposed to is going to affect the effect on your body, whether it is a simple virus which can affect you badly, or it could be a genetic switch that turns on cancer. I think we need to look at that. I think Anuj and I also spoke a lot often about, I still remember talking about planning our Vidyavihar campus, and he would always stress upon good spaces in the campus so that there's a lot of breathing space. And I think, again, again, as a campus, are we illustrating what is possible for the city to do? And I think in many ways we are, because we're trying to show that you can have the city deserves a beautiful space. As the city, I'm not talking about the campus itself. I'm talking the city deserves for all its citizens to have livable spaces. And so I think that's what we need to work on. A process of discovery, a process of good public health, and how do you create that climate of health where everybody can go and get educated or get healthcare and can realize their dreams, realize their education, what they want to do. And that's what we need to fashion as a solution for the city. We hope we're trying to do that in our own way, and we think lots of us can.
Thank you very much, Samir. You covered quite an extensive bit for us in over 10 minutes. Let me see if I can very quickly sort of pull out some of the nuggets of that. I think one thing you hit on very, very clearly was that every business really has to see itself as a social organization, and that we're just as responsible for all that this city and the people in it need, because we're all stakeholders and therefore all have to benefit. So I think that's a powerful message for us as a solution provider. We saw those that have come together in the pandemic to provide for those that do not have. And like you said, your example of raising your beds from 20 to 377, with that spirit that came together to say, okay, we can provide. Can that be something that we do permanently and not something we do only when we're in crisis mode? So
there were so many people who came from. We had Rotary organizations, we had businesses. Correct. If they couldn't do it, they came forward to say, how can we help you? Yeah.
Correct. Absolutely. And interestingly, you talked about education, and I'm using a word you didn't use, but as a way of perhaps leveling and providing an opportunity for no matter what walk of life we come from, to say, if I'm talented, if I want an education, if I want a choice in education, how do we make that accessible to anybody and everybody in the city, and not just as a matter of privilege?
Right.
So yes.
Right.
And third, again with health, the fact that health can decimate. It doesn't matter what you have and don't have. It could take away from every one of us. So again, providing or creating health facilities that ensures that everybody has access. Like you said, any of us should be as comfortable going to a government teaching hospital as we might to any other facility.
Right.
So thank you for those three.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great segue to you, Deval, particularly the businesses as a social organization and therefore part of the whole giving and not just profit making. Over to you for solutions and opportunities you see for the future.
No. Thank you. And I think what I heard loud and clear from both Anuj and Samir is that the poor don't need poor solutions. And I think there is a mindset that funders have across the world, honestly, that survival is a metric of success versus a thriving community. And so I think a lot of the solutions that we fund are really just are we enabling these groups to survive? And I think that none of us have gotten where we are on mere survival, especially when these incidences, whether it's natural disasters, whether it's health risks, whether it's other issues, political unrest, et cetera, whatever it is, I think those that have, again, lesser access to wealth are greater at risk, I guess, for this throwing them off. And so I think that's number one. I think as funders, we need to realize again that we don't want affordable solutions, again, what Anuj said, but adequate, if not more than adequate solutions. Let's realize that 50% if not more of our population, again, live in such situations that it is very hard for them, even if they want to go to school, absorb what's happening. They don't have the nutrition, they don't have the sanitation, they don't have the housing that Anuj, very eloquently spoke about. And so, if anything, we need to have greater solutions, which may be more expensive per se, but they're more sustainable. And so I think for us, what we've seen in a few different levels, I guess, the good thing that has come out of COVID is that givers have realized the way they've structured grants, the way they have sort of straitjacketed organizations to say only you can do A, B, or C. If you're, for example, funding an education organization, all of that has been thrown out the window when schools are not even open now. And so then where is the flexibility for organizations to invest in digital, to give sort of a new curriculum and create it, to really figure out what are the needs of the community today, and then how do I address those needs? And so one of the foundations we've been very fortunate to work with, not just as Dasra, but the sector overall, is A.T.E. Chandra Foundation. And I think just really this premise of trust the NGO leaders as you trust for-profit entrepreneurs to make the right decision. And so give them the flexibility to listen to the community, give them the ability to respond as these major or minor disasters hit on a weekly, if not monthly basis, and enable them to do what's actually their community is asking them to do, not something that you were forced to put in a proposal 2 years ago, which may not even be relevant today. And so I think that's number one. The funders are slowly realizing the need of flexible funding, trusting NGOs, letting their communities actually drive the strategy versus a donor driving that strategy sitting in Mumbai, Delhi, or abroad. And so I think that's one big solution we're starting to see. But to be honest with you, Iris, this is something as Dasra we've been preaching for 21 years, and still majority of donors don't give that level of trust and funding to organizations. I mean, even Praja, I'm sure, is a perfect example of, Milind and the team had no idea they would be running these webinars 4 months ago. But some of their funders have said, I didn't give you money for this, I gave you money for something else. And so I think that's one real solution we need to work towards, which is trusting our NGOs, trusting they have the communities in mind, and give them the flexible support that they need to actually invest in these long-term solutions. And I think that's one of the downfalls, honestly, of this CSR mindset has been, I'll give you money, and most corporates don't even give money till mid to end of the year. And at that stage, you have 3 months time to create behavioral change and impact in community and report back on that impact. So really just changing that dynamic and being, again, more flexible, because I think if communities are more empowered and they have a voice, then they will actually demand what's rightfully theirs. And we have seen shifts in the last 5 years, anything from direct payments into individuals' bank accounts, not just in India, but in Brazil and in other countries I've seen. If you give the poor access to money, they will spend it the right ways. They care about their families more than we can ever imagine. They know what the solutions are. So I think that's one sort of solution. I think the second, the business side, and I think we've been fortunate over the last 4 or 5 months, is working with large business families in Mumbai, in Pune, and in Ahmedabad, really to reinstitute or institute for the first time a social compact. And so they are actually now listening to very well-known organizations like Jivika Bureau or Center for Social Justice or Jan Sahas, NGOs that have been working with migrant and informal workers for decades. And they're actually having these NGOs create, in essence, a compact similar to what corporates did 20 years ago on child labor, which is not a government mandated contract or compact, but it's a corporate mandated compact that says, going forward, we will make sure everyone we employ directly or indirectly has, again, some level of social benefits, are registered to government schemes, and if possible, to Anuja's point, because this has come loud and clear from these informal workers themselves, some, whether it's funding, access to finance, or even opportunities for adequate housing. That is the crux of why these individuals are called migrants. And let's be very clear. I, for example, was born and brought up in Houston, Texas. I've lived in Mumbai for 21 years. As Samir said, I love this city for all the reasons he said, but I'm not considered a migrant just because I pay rent in a flat. Anuj, I know right now for various reasons is in Boston, but he's not considered a migrant because he's in Boston, because he pays rent in a building. And these same migrants and informal workers pay rent many times more on a square footage basis than many of us do for the rent control reasons you mentioned earlier, Iris. But we need to make them sort of the decision makers. And so to see these corporate leaders come together and say they will change their ways, and they will actually not just work within their own industries, but also working with other apex bodies like CII, Chambers of Commerce in these cities, again, with these NGOs, which honestly may be considered rights-based NGOs, but these are the NGOs who've been serving these individuals that all of us have overlooked. So they're letting these groups come up with the compact, create a charter and a self-assessment that the corporate can do. And honestly, some of these corporates have said, we want the NGOs to evaluate us year on year. So then we ensure that there's dignity and equity to every single person we employ. And I bring this up because 20 years ago, for economic reasons, no one talked about child labor. Everyone said it's okay, we don't employ them, our contractors or subcontractors do. Global brands we all know had child labor in Kanchipuram, in Mirzapur, UP, etc. But there was a movement that they said we may have to charge or pay a little bit more to our staff. But we had an ethical responsibility as a company to ensure that we don't have child labor in our factories. And I think that same sort of mindset now has to shift with corporate India, that if we are not providing not just an honest wage, but a wage that provides dignity and equity for individuals to live and thrive in our cities, then we have failed. And so there's a reckoning, I would say, where we are very impressed that these corporates are coming together and have made this mandate to sort of move forward and bring others to the mix to ensure that this is the way of operating in India going forward and not just sort of a good to have. So I'd say that's the second. And I guess the third, really, from an NGO perspective, and again, a lot has been spoken about in terms of public infrastructure. I think NGOs are realizing that they need to work closer with government, and they want to. And so we have seen instances, again, you know, in this crisis, whether it was a Sneha working in Dharavi or Swasth working in Jogeshwari and other NGOs that have done fabulous work on the healthcare side or the food distribution side or even the education side. But I think there needs to be greater synergies, because what NGOs have to offer is innovation, but they don't have the ability to scale. And honestly, government on the flip side has scale, but they don't have the ability to innovate given election cycles, you know, budgets, et cetera. And so I think that the closeness of these groups and the corporate sector, especially all coming together, and as Anuj put it, this is all of our cities. It's not an NGO does this, a corporate does this, a government does this. All of us need to come together to really say, how is each of our citizens, our brothers and sisters, how are they living the same life we live? And I think that's slowly happening. And I think the worst thing that can occur, honestly, is if we forget, if we move on like we all do, to other things because we have Wi-Fi now and our kids are finally out of their house. And I just wanted to end with a quote that Anuj actually reminded me of from again, Gandhiji, which is really, the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. And I think that was, the founding principles of our country. And I think we're all responsible for not living those principles today.
Yes, thank you very much, Deva. Absolutely. That was wonderful. And so to sort of summarize perhaps what you took us to, and you ended with closer working by the whole NGO, nonprofit sector with governments to more finely tune that. You emphasized the fact that finally we're going back to social compacts that businesses actually make with all of the people that work with them and for them, and that will actually provide perhaps a much greater opportunity for access and equity than we otherwise have seen. And of course, interestingly, that all of those and all of us that are donors, that are providers, that come together for NGOs, that we trust those working on the ground. And we actually trust them and give them the flexibility to actually roll out what they need at the hour of the need, rather than mandate from the top and from far away often as well about what's needed. So thank you for all those three. Thank you very much. And what we're going to do now, we're at about 5:09. So we have about 20 minutes here. And I believe I could run over 10 minutes more. I think the project team said I could do that. We'll try not to. So what I'm going to do is perhaps go straight to many of the questions that have actually come from the audience. And there are some really interesting ones. So I'm going to read out the question, and I'm going to invite either the panelists that the question is for or any one of you to respond to that. And then we can see what discussions that brings up for us and see how far we go with the time. Is that fine with all of you as panelists?
Yes.
Okay, superb. So here's my first one. This is a question for Mr. Somaiya. With the new education policy, will it help to blur the digital divide, enhance learning, and in return boost the social infrastructure of Mumbai?
I don't have a great answer. I can just say I don't know. I can say I like the new education policy. I don't know how it will play on the new, or whether it's going to blur the digital divide or not. It allows for learning in the concept of credit banks, so you can do something here and then you can exchange it there. So I think it's a positive document, but we'll have to see as it develops. So I like the document. I'll give you some, not as a digital divide, but I'll give you just a slightly different example. We started teaching Prakrit, or we've been teaching Prakrit for many years. And interestingly, I got students who signed up from New Jersey, Melbourne, Karnataka, and of course, Mumbai. Now, this is a diploma course. But one of the students called me from New Jersey and said, why can't we enroll in your master's program? And then I said, right now, UGC only allows for X percentage of our time to be taught online. Now, currently, of course, everything will be online so long as the pandemic survives. This has nothing to do with the new education policy. But tomorrow, we need to figure out what models can we enable so that the digital infrastructure that we are all building and also learning to adapt to can be used to complement physical infrastructure of teaching. So could you in the future create, so we run a rural school in Dahanu, could you create a physical infrastructure which had digital transmission so that you still have proctors or teaching assistants or teachers in those villages which help guide a classroom full of students, so that the whole education experience is expanded compared to what they would have today? And could that continue once the pandemic? So I think these are interesting times, and certainly more opportunities today than they were yesterday, so long as we seize the opportunity to create a better and more equal world.
Thank you for that, Samir. I might add that there is hope that because the NEP has unlocked the credit banks, that actually from an access to education, or perhaps an opportunity to provide equity, you could come in and go out as you needed for education. Yeah. That is the hope And let's hope that we can deliver that.
Can I add one more thing? I think the idea of also encouraging our languages also helps, because language also needs to be seen as either it's an enabler or it obstructs. So I think we run a lot of schools in Marathi, Kannada and Gujarati medium, and we see that our education system should be breaking down walls rather than creating them. So long as you create opportunity for all people to crisscross and go further in whichever medium, and to make sure that they're all also good in English, because English is also here and it's strong and it's global, I think it's a good thing going forward.
Thank you, Samir. I have the next question for Anuj. Being a part of various causes of change in the city through UDRI and Praja, what are the immediate actions to be taken as far as urban planning and city governance is concerned in Mumbai City? And I guess focus is on the immediate action.
I think that the point is that when you talk about immediate, I'd say that planning in general is more about prevention rather than about cure. And that's how we have to see it for cities. It's how we see it also in corporates. It's more about prevention than cure. And that's also actually, Deval, one of the reasons that it's hard to get funding for things like planning and governance, because people don't see them as immediate. They don't see them as urgent. They see them as optional. In some cases, they think of them as a privilege of the rich, but actually, really, these are most important for the poor. Actually, they're important for everybody equally. So I think that it's hard for me to sometimes think about what you need to do immediately, but I think immediately, really what you need to think about is your priorities. I think there was also perhaps another question in the chat about finances. And I think that if you look at our priorities, when we can spend money on the Western Coastal Road, but we can't spend money on housing, when the government actually doesn't need to get into acquisition cost of land in many cases, whether it's the central government or the state government, I think that's something that we need to figure out. So you're really looking at construction costs. It seems to me also a bit strange that we say we don't have the money to start, because all these investments will pay for themselves. I think that long-term investments require a chunk of capital upfront, but really they will pay for themselves. So I think that the kinds of things that we're talking about world over, people have financed them successfully. There's a lot of development finance available. I don't see that as a problem. Immediately, I think really what we need to do is we need to relook at our priorities. We need to relook at our goals and objectives. That's the first thing that we need to do. And we need to remove some things from this list that we have right now. I think we also sometimes, we decide what the answer is, and then we say, that's what we're going to do. And we make that as a goal. So somehow, somewhere or the other, we say that now FSI has become the goal, actually, rather than being one of the means. So we start talking about that. And instead, you should say that we want so many homes with these kinds of living conditions, connected to public transport, connected to footpaths, connected to roads, whatever it is. I remember Samir and I once went to talk to somebody about a SRA project that they had done. And they were shocked when we asked them about what about the footpath? And they were looking at us in blank amazement. They're like, but there's a road there. So I said, yeah, but people walk on footpaths, not on roads. So they had never made that calculation. So clearly it wasn't one of their priorities. So I think that, Mumbai is a great city. We have to stop it from being a terrible place. I think Charles Correa said that, a great city, terrible place. So I think we need to get to great city, great place. As Charles also said, we are a city on the water, but you wouldn't know it because it's not part of our imagination. It could again be one of our planning principles that we say that we want public access to the water. We have a wonderful opportunity with the Eastern Waterfront, which is owned by the government, the central government. So I think we have a lot of opportunities. We don't need that much money if we really get our priorities straight. And the money that we need, I don't mean we don't need a lot of money. We need a lot of money, but not by the standards of a city and by what's available today for these kinds of projects. And I think that it's all quite doable.
Anuj, can I throw in a question with regard to immediate action? You talked
Yeah.
about the fact that cities actually have, by the 74th Amendment, the mandate to run themselves, govern themselves, and therefore be accountable to its own citizens. What can be done immediately to wrest that control completely? Because, like we heard the mayor say, and you reiterated, there are still lots of, lots of ways in which we're prevented from doing it. What can we do immediately to wrest back that control?
Yeah, so I think that immediately you have to start discussing on what you will transfer and when and how. But it can't be done immediately because you require to ensure that there's capacity. When you toss this ball, there needs to be capacity where it lands. So there needs to be office space, there needs to be people, there needs to be training, there needs to be a clear plan that transfers knowledge, that gives authority, and that transfers also the network that there is. So I think that there's a lot that I think it's difficult to say that tomorrow let's do this. And I know I disappoint people, and I'm probably disappointing a lot of people right now. But I think that to do something in a hurry and do it badly, it's not the right way to do it. I think we have to do it. It's all important stuff. You have to work on it tomorrow. But you won't be able to break ground on a project tomorrow, probably. It may take a little bit longer.
Thank you, Anuj. Since we have, of course, Praja in the house, either Nitai or Milind, could one of you or both of you comment on the fact that I know Praja is working on this, is looking at how we can wrest back that control. How far do you think we are as a city in getting that back? Are there things we can or are doing as Praja to actually push that much, much faster, much, much further?
So I think while they're unmuting, maybe, oh, okay, Nitai is here.
Nitai, come on.
Yeah, Iris, thank you. Praja has been working in the last several years on this area of urban governance. And I think this is the time that we really need to focus on urban governance. And take opportunity of this crisis to realize what has gone wrong in our cities and what we need to and how we need to correct. There are some brilliant suggestions and answers and approaches that has been set up by this by the panelists out here today. Just to fill in to the people what Praja has done in the last 2 years, Praja has been working to understand how urban governance is practiced across the country. We have done a study which is perhaps one of its kind, where our team led by Milind and others have gone across the country to all the states in India and have understood how urban governance is practiced, what are the rules, regulations. It has spoken to stakeholders across the country who are practitioners, whether they are corporators, whether there are municipal commissioners, whether there are MLAs, how urban governance actually has been practiced. And what we find and what we understand is that there has been a tremendous neglect of urban India. And that is something that we are seeing during this pandemic. The crisis that the social infrastructure, the physical infrastructure has been very, very difficult to cope up, has felt a lot of stress to cope up with this pandemic. So we need to really move quickly. And that is why we are actually working on these groups of seminars to reimagine how Mumbai can actually be literally reimagined to become a much more citizen-friendly, much more accountable, much more responsible, and allowing people to take charge of their own cities. It is something that we realize that we need to get people to take charge of their own cities. Also, the other aspect, which is critical, where people perhaps sometimes do not talk about, is the issue of democracy. We have democracy at the central level, we have democracy at the state level, but we do not have grassroots level democracy. Our elected representatives at the grassroots, our municipal corporators, our mayor, are not empowered to take decisions or make rules and laws. We are dependent on the state, we are dependent on the center. Even the 74th Amendment that has been implemented way back has really not been implemented across the country. We have seen very few cities. In fact, fortunately for Mumbai, is out of the 18 functions that were supposed to be devolved, 9 have actually been devolved to the city. 9 is still run by semi-government organizations, whether it's like MMRDA, MHADA, and other organizations, but it is not truly devolved. So we need to take this opportunity to do that, not only just in Mumbai, but perhaps across the country. So I think it's very critical for us to really make these changes.
Thank you very much, Nidai. Deval, I'm going to address this question to you. Do non-profit organizations, businesses, and CSR leaders with the right approach and thinking towards issues necessarily drive government to adopt approaches to changes in policy and implementation? And if your answer is yes, how do we use this given these learnings from COVID?
So I guess I'll give you 2 instances. I think number one, we've seen with, again, our partner NGOs, for example, CWAS, they are out of Sapt University. They work on urban sanitation and housing in different cities across India. They're an NGO, but they work very closely with community and government from day one. Similar to actually what I just said, even the research that Praja has done on transforming urban governance has been very much linked to what governments are already doing, what civil society is already doing, and what communities or leaders are doing as well. And so I think there are definitely instances where in India we've seen great partnerships form. I think the criticality of those partnerships or why they're successful is because from day one, all stakeholders are coming together and are aligning on an issue to solve. And so I think this sort of mindset, and we as an NGO ourselves have fallen into this trap as well, thinking we'll come up with the best solution and then we'll hand it to government, and then we'll get, we'll feel upset when they don't take it. I think it's all of our issues again are the same, and so we need to work together. And so I think that is definitely a possibility. I think on the social compact stuff, and I want to bring this out just because we've had child labor laws again in our country for many, many years, but that didn't solve it. And so I do think there's also a time where, unfortunately, even with the best laws that we have, they're not enforced by those who need to enforce them. And so I do think, and again, I think Praja does a fantastic job in this, is really, they do it on the citizen side of how do citizens keep other citizens accountable. I think the same thing has to happen in the corporate sector. And while, again, we have very good laws, they're not being practiced. And there are many individuals in the corporate sector that know that, and they, again, turn a blind eye. And so how do we, again, as a country, hold each other accountable and then, have government there to support, but don't necessarily rely on them coming in to be the ones who create the law, to police the law and implement it. That's been what we've tried and it hasn't worked. So I think we need to now change the dynamics and maybe have a greater level of responsibility amongst all of the stakeholder groups, but really keeping community at the core. And to be honest with you, even in this conversation, I don't think the 3 of us are representative of the Mumbai community. And I think that's what we all need to do, is really get that voice more, their voice, not our voice, because we already have a lot of this. And we have done a poor job in ensuring that others, have access to what we have.
Right. Thank you, Deva. We have a speaker who's asked about using lands for faraway housing, considerations for creating sustainable communities. New satellites should be planned to have jobs, education, cultural components. Any thoughts if this is being thought of?
Well, I think that I don't think that it's at implementation stage or any of those stages yet, but in terms of research, certainly there's a paper, Shirish Patel, Jasmine Saluja, Urmi Kapadia, on really 2 sites, two actual sites where you could probably put, close to 1 million people in each site, not far away from current railway hubs. So they would then, of course, every community that you forms its own service network. And so you have a little bit of, there's always some local jobs that come up as a result of people living there. But these are not far away. So Vasai Virar or Mira Bhayandar, there are people commuting to all the other hubs for employment already. So I think that's why I said that the place is there. It's a question of whether we do the last mile connectivity. and then whether we want to go ahead and develop the land and actually create the housing and the social infrastructure. And also then zoning, because you could create some offices, you could create some industrial facilities, and then certainly jobs and other things would get set up.
Correct, and move there. And we saw that happen in Mumbai a while back, where actually businesses sort of moved along the line up north, and that changed the dynamics for people who lived up north. And we didn't just have this north-south commute that we had every morning and south-north every evening.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Another question, and Samir, how would you describe the role of businesses and business entrepreneurs in the new normal? I think you partially responded to this in your talks, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit more.
I think right now we're all grappling with also our own realities as sustainable businesses, which need to be also commercially viable. That's also we are facing challenges on a daily basis, and we can't wish them away. It's like being in a ship in a foggy storm. You want to make sure that you don't hit an iceberg and you don't see a lighthouse. And that, I'm honestly saying, is but you need to get your team together. You need to keep the morale up, and you need to find people to think about how you're going to deal with the immediate issues and also the longer term issues. What can you do in terms of a work from home world? What can you do to meet physically, and when do you actually do things physically, and when you do things? So I don't have any magical answers, but I'm just wanting people to appreciate that as businesses, we are also really in this storm. And whether it is a hospital or an education institution or a business, these are realities that are not easy to wish away. The new normal will happen when there is the new normal. Currently, we are in the current abnormal. And honestly, every day brings it a new challenge. Businesses do a remarkable job of putting food, besides putting the product in the hands of a customer, they also put food on the plates of their employees. And that is also a great, I think that is also something that always is a real issue. And businesses are, as I say, not in the new normal, they are in the current abnormal. And that challenge is what we face together. And I don't have a straight answer there.
Thank you, Samir. Deval, I'm going to give you this next question. Do you think businesses and people are shifting out of Mumbai city to cities like Ahmedabad, Pune, Indore, etc., given the issues that are being highlighted? And if yes, how do you as leaders think that Mumbai can get its act together? I know you've answered some of this in both the sets of inputs that you gave us, but perhaps you can deepen that with conversations you've probably had already with companies, with migrants, etc., and give us a little bit more breadth on that.
I mean, I think at least when we're looking at informal workers or migrants, unfortunately, they've been treated poorly across India. And so it's not that they had access to housing or these rights in these different cities. And so there's definitely, as we all saw and still see, the photos and the exodus. So I don't think very few cities, I guess, have been immune to that. I think, there are some steps, again, that the government has taken, the ration card being valid in all states, and hopefully rights will be given to where you reside and work, not just where you were born. Again, like I've been given those rights, even though I was born abroad, and Anuj has those rights in Boston right now. And so I think it's important that everyone else has that. And so I think that I don't think it's city specific. I think these issues are, again, pan-India. And I think, especially when you think about the corporate sector in particular, Iris, and when you look at manufacturing, most companies have offices and factories across the country as well. And so it is about, in these hard times, like Samir said, and I very much sympathize for businesses, but is it about how do we then make changes so when we're back in this new normal, which may not be today, but it's making that commitment, because when things do turn around, I think it's going to be important. I think Mumbai will always, just like New York City, will always have a charm to it that people will always come back to. And so I don't think that's to worry about, but but hopefully, again, the have-nots become the haves in the next phase of our journey.
Right. Thank you, Deval. Projects like the Coastal Road projects, Western and Eastern Express highways have all had vested interests of both businesses and governments. Do you feel this is more of a blockage affecting consensus among businesses and CSR leaders who may have intentions to drive the app solutions for the cities? Anuj, would you like to take that question?
Can you just repeat the last bit again? Because
yes, I know. So do you feel that the fact that businesses and governments have vested interests in projects like the Western, Eastern Coastal Road, have these caused the blockages affecting consensus that you normally get between business CSR leaders? And what can you do to sort of change that?
I think that our theory of change, or whatever, if you could call it that, is that you have to actually have much more citizen engagement, because I believe that if politicians feel that they won't get re-elected because there's citizen opposition to an issue, then they will act accordingly. And I think that's what we really need to work much harder to mobilize. And that's perhaps how we can bring consensus about. You have to involve the people in the equation. The question you asked, I think it left out a little bit people. It talked about business and government. And sure, some business would like to have these contracts. They're big contracts. So there's big money perhaps to be made. And when it's big contracts, only a small number of people can do them usually. So sure, there's certain companies that would be very happy to have them. But if they're not there because it's not a priority of the people and they very clearly express it to the government, then I think that perhaps these projects wouldn't come about to begin with. So we really need to work hard on mobilizing as much public awareness as we can, engage with the public, inform the public, and I think that's why that's what really the nonprofits need to do much more, to actually sell themselves, or to not sell themselves, but to explain themselves to the public.
Thank you, Anuj. And I'm going to read out our last question for the evening. And each of you could maybe respond for 30 seconds or a minute. It is this. Both a pro and a con, this character of Mumbai citizens, popularly called the Chalta Hai attitude. How do you see that in the middle of this topic, where we're talking about a city of resilience? Your responses. You could start with Deval, Samir, and then Anuj.
Sure. I think, all of us are comfortable in our homes with access, air conditioning, and everything else. And so I do think that this saying needs to be put to everyone, especially those who have left the city now and may not come back. And so I think there's a misconception there. And I think in a conversation or a webinar we had, Anuaga actually said this is, why do we always want our poor to be those who are resilient? And so I do think we need to sort of just figure out how all of us either are resilient with the same sort of infrastructure, and then maybe this Chalta Hai attitude should move forward.
Thank you. Samir?
I think Chalta Hai sounds nice when we say we are chal rahe hain, and I'll take it in my stride. But Chalta Hai should not be there, because we should, as citizens, insist and demand for good quality and livable infrastructure and surroundings.
Right. Thank you. And Anuj?
Yeah, I think that says it well. Chalta Hai means that you adjust and you make do with what you've got, which in a crisis you need to do. So it's good because you survive and you act and you persist with whatever you're doing. You try kind of make do, but at the same time, it should not get in the way for us to create long-term change, because we don't have to live in the conditions that we do. We don't have to subject these conditions on everybody in the city. We need to really galvanize ourselves and action to change, and it's possible, it's achievable, we have to do it.
Thank you. And with that, I'm going to bring our webinar to a close with just a few perhaps quick summaries. I've said this before, but I'll repeat it again, where a solution that we brought out was that the 74th Amendment allows us as cities to take back control. We need to push and nudge that we do that in that direction and faster. Praja's on hand, of course, to push as hard as possible, but all the rest of us here on this webinar and most of us as citizens in the city can do our bit every single day. Second, housing that's safe and accessible, which will solve a number of problems because it gets bundled in with housing. Sameer's point that as businesses, we are all social organizations contributing to all of the public and social goods. And therefore, we have to find ways to ensure that there's equal access to health, education, no matter who we are in the city. And there were solutions for trust the people on the ground who are making last mile decisions, give them flexibility, and the social compact that businesses had in the past need to come back, probably with much, much more force, so that everybody in all our organizations and stakeholders are taken care of. Thank you, each one of you, to the panelists for the time you spent today, and my apologies, I know we have run over. Thank you all in the audience for listening and sending us your questions. And of course, thank you, Praja, for using this spirit and this technology and opportunity that we've unlocked for ourselves in the pandemic to come together to solve these problems. We're all voting to take this forward and to keep coming together, as Sameer said, this whole spirit to keep co-locating together in every forum possible to solve problems. Thank you all and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.